it's sort of easy to harsh on the super creative office, right? Where it became sometime in the aughts or the 90s. It started with the dot-com boom, didn't it? Where you just sort of knew that you were in that office with little skateboards and various games. There'd be a foosball table, and there'd be either Herman Miller chairs, those super comfortable, meshy, bouncy chairs, or there would be lots of big Pilates balls all over the place. Is this something that's become so insufferable, such a cliche, that it shouldn't be allowed? Where do you two stand on office furniture and what it says about whether we're playing or working and whether we're insufferably creative or just getting our creative on?
Well, if you don't set the right context and the right atmosphere with neon signs, air on chairs, bouncy balls, concrete floors, and no ceiling tiles, you're not a tech company. And so the first thing you got to do is rip down the ceiling tiles, throw those things out, get rid of them, hopefully recycle them, rip up the carpets, hopefully recycle those, leave the exposed concrete, get your bouncy balls and put up a couple of neon signs, and all of a sudden you've become technology. That's our perspective.
I like this. So if you're pitching a tech VC, your main job is to just talk about how you got rid of all these things and replaced all these things, so your tech is going to be incredible.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. I mean, if you have a good 10-page pitch deck that kind of defines the problem, defines your solution as the answer to that problem, simplifies the revenue model to say how you're going to make money, and then boom, you got some neon signs, you basically increase your multiple, which is ultimately what most tech companies are trying to do.
So what has the neon sign below done to your valuation?
Good question. We haven't tested that yet. So we're still working on the next valuation. But our current owners are quite happy with the development of our company. And the neon is just sort of the jewelry that accentuates the success.
But why tech from, when were neon signs? Mid 20th century. Why does this show advanced software chops?
Well, because it's sort of the embodiment of sustainability. Because the old neon sign of Las Vegas days was a massive consumer of electricity, big polluter in the environment. The modern LED sign is a very efficient LED. It's a very efficient way of expressing, your personality and also still being relatively sustainable in the economy.
I mean, in all seriousness, though, it's migrated, right? It's not just the tech companies. Now it's like the bougie coffee shop.
They all have it, yeah.
They all have it, and they're all like, sip, drink, order some coffee no one's heard of or whatever.
Oh, my mom has one too, welcome home. She's got this big pink neon sign, welcome home, in her living room. She was like, I got to have one. So it's proliferating all across America and Europe.
So who is Tom Christenson?
Who is Tom Christenson? That is a great question. So we're delighted to have Tom Christenson with us today. He joins us from Amsterdam. And just so we're clear, Alejandro and I are on the East Coast of the U.S. Tom is in Amsterdam. We're doing this across time zones, across countries, because that's how we roll. Tom is joining us to talk about his work with TBAuctions, which is a multi-brand digital auction platform for depreciated business assets. And so when companies have assets that have basically outlived their accounting useful life, this is a way for them to be disposed of, and it's a way for people to get access to these industrial assets at a really wonderful reduced price. Just to give people a perspective, because it's not an area that I think we're typically used to thinking about. The company did about $1.5 billion in revenue last year from brokering these sales. So this is a very large company, and then they operate in the Nordic countries, they operate in Benelux, they operate in Britain, and then throughout continental Europe. Have I left out any countries? I'm not sure.
No, that's pretty much it. The full EU 27 spectrum, a couple of others that are not involved in the EU itself. So yeah, we have sellers from about 32 countries, and we support buyers from nearly 170 countries.
You need these days an interplanetary plan. That's like slide 12.
Well, ultimately in the business pitch deck, we do have the interplanetary plan. Yes.
Is that before
First, we'll
the
conquer
neon
North
signs?
America, then the rest of the world, then we're going to Mars with Elon.
I like that. You remember the old New Yorker's map of the world, where
Yeah.
Ninth Avenue then comes right at the other continents. I'm interested that your sequence sort of, I think America was right before Mars. Did I get that right? The rest of the
it's
world
on
is
the
somewhere
path.
in there.
The way we are today in the United States, America is just about as close to aliens as can be.
I am Alejandro Juárez. Crawford, my brilliant and unstoppable co-host, is Miriam Plavin-Masterman, and we're on a mission to make experiments of your own as normal as watching videos on your phone. Welcome to What If Instead, the podcast. Now, Tom, as I've learned about you and TBAuctions, and I'm not assuming the two are synonymous, I have understood at least one what if instead, if I'm getting it right, if I'm grokking it, to be what if instead large equipment, from a tractor to an MRI machine, all the way through to the kinds of equipment we use in industry that regular people don't always know the words for, right? That these large pieces of equipment don't just get thrown out at the end of their life, and both at the end of their accounting life, shall we say, while they still have useful life. It sounds like your what if instead is that these pieces of equipment should have a second life, and that we can use digital auctions not just to get a table on Facebook Marketplace from the next town over, but to make this kind of second life possible. Am I getting that right? Talk to us, please, about what the big what if instead for you is at present.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the fundamental of the platform that we're building is based on the idea of what if instead of throwing this stuff out in the trash, we actually enabled someone else to use it. And you can look across the wide variety of categories of used business equipment that have served their useful life. 3, 4, 5, 7 years is kind of what most organizations, businesses buy things for at full price, and then they depreciate over a 5 or a 6 or a 7 year basis. And then at the end of that depreciated life, the asset on their accounting books is useless. But most of those machines, most of that equipment, whether it's, as we were joking about before, the Herman Miller Aeron chair or an MRI machine or a tractor or many, 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 almost anything you can imagine that was built and purchased in roughly 5 to 7 years, a business has depreciated that. And they're looking then to replace that asset. And rather than throwing that asset into the trash, into the garbage bins, what if we found customers that could actually use it for another 5 or 7 years, and they put it back onto their books as new, and then they depreciate it for the next 5 to 7? And that's the fundamental of finding the auction mechanism, and what TBAuctions enables for our sellers. They can sell these used assets, they can get value, appreciate that value, and actually recognize it as a profit on their P&L, and then enable it to be used going forward, which is awesome because it offsets, getting new raw materials extracted from the ground to create new machines. It also offsets all the CO2 associated with the manufacturing of those machines just by enabling their life a little bit longer than if they just went into the scrapyard.
Fascinating. So to follow up on that for a bit, how you had mentioned that you have sellers in 32 countries and buyers in 107 countries.
Yep.
I get, so since it's a two-sided market, which is the harder side to build, and which one are you more focused on?
TBAuctions, much like any marketplace business, Amazon Marketplace, Uber, the marketplace of drivers and riders, you always have a bit of a tension between the seller and the buyer. For us, though, the biggest challenge is sourcing the supply, getting the regular stream of assets that are available for sale so that the bidders, because everyone's always out looking to buy something, the bidders can find the product that they're looking for at the time that they're looking for it. So for us, the bigger challenge on that two-sided marketplace is not finding buyers, but rather it is finding the sellers with the assets that trust the mechanism of auctioning versus other mechanisms of either the certainty of disposal, throwing it into the trash, or trying to sell it with a classified ad or giving it back to the dealer or the original equipment manufacturer who produced the asset in the first place.
And so how do you get them to trust you to do that process?
It's a fundamental part of building our platform with a degree of transparency so that the seller trusts that the auction mechanism will get them a good value. It's also ensuring that the seller has access to the biggest set of bidders. For us, we've spent a lot of money building the scale in what I refer to as the flywheel effect of our business to have over 700,000 bidders. And when you have that degree of liquidity in a marketplace, I know it's a boatload of people that are looking to buy things. Having that access to 700,000 people that potentially, or businesses that potentially are interested in your product, is a real attractor for them. So the value proposition to a seller who would otherwise be looking to throw the asset away is that in an auction, in 7 or 14 days, the asset is sold and they get a good value because there's a significant amount of interest in the 700,000 bidders that are looking at those assets.
Tom, you might have seen Mim smile broadly when you mentioned flywheel effects. We have just written a book, Mim and I, which comes out next summer, called One Size Fits None. And we focus in it on the wrong kinds of flywheel effects, where in our search for a flywheel, this is back to that VC deck we talked about, in our search for ultimate scalability, right? And something that will just replicate. And the idea of the flywheel, for users not familiar, is it just keeps turning without any extra energy applied, right?
But it takes a lot of energy to get it started. So, you think of a windmill or a water mill, it takes a lot of effort, but then, it self-sustains. It's awesome.
And there are, in business, I would posit good flywheels and bad flywheels. And maybe I'm stating this in too much of a moral way. There are flywheels that are good at meeting the needs in a very responsive way of a lot of types of customers. And then there are flywheels that tend to put us in a position of, if our need isn't exactly what my large multinational bank is used to dealing with, then it might as well not exist. And so I wonder if you could talk about, in what ways is the flywheel you've built, I should say, in what ways is the flywheel that you've built effective at meeting lots of disparate needs, especially since we know that you're routing much of this equipment to folks who otherwise might not have access to it. Can you talk to us about that?
I had never really thought of the Batman versus the Joker concept of good flywheels and bad flywheels. It's an interesting one. Yeah, if you really think about it, there are bad flywheels and bad flywheels that they're self-sustaining because you have a whole bunch of new sellers of badly produced products. You could almost even say the Amazon flywheel is creating a whole bunch of garbage. In fact, I was talking to a candidate for a position that I'm recruiting for here who said that they were leaving another home marketplace. I won't say the name, but they were leaving them because they felt bad. They were just promoting the sale of more cheap furniture. And they didn't want to, add more to the waste that's being created. She was very attracted to the flywheel of TBAuctions because we're creating the self-sustaining momentum of putting assets back to use and enabling the ability for especially developing economies to have access to discounted and to depreciated assets, as you described earlier, where, hey, an MRI machine that's no longer useful to the British medical system is extremely valuable in Indonesia, the Philippines, and in India. And after it's been depreciated after 5 years, we can now enable that product to be sold, shipped, and reused to allow those types of organizations to purchase 10, 15, or 20 machines where otherwise their more limited budgets might only enable a purchase of 1 or 2 machines. So the flywheel of our business, adding more of these assets into the reusable world, I think is a very positive type of a flywheel effect. When I say our market opportunity in Europe, I've often said is about 250 billion euros of assets are sold. Used business assets are sold every year. That's really a floor. It's not a ceiling. That floor is representative of just the assets that are currently traded versus
Mm.
all the other assets. It's so much easier to just throw it out into the trash. If we create a simple, easy to use flywheel effect, folks will end up being able to put those assets to use in other economies or at other users.
So, a majority, or at least many of our guests on What If Instead, are innovators and enablers of innovation in the global south. And we've had folks who are really leading globally on vehicle to grid solutions in ways that the power centers of the global north have barely conceived of. We've had folks leading on healthcare innovation that deal with the intricacies of culture and stakeholders in a specific place. And I want to ask you, how do you think about both the reverse innovation piece here, right? Which I believe shouldn't really be called reverse, but with respect to Govindarajan and Trimble, the advantages that can be had when the global south isn't just sort of taking the leavings of Europe, for example, right, but is coming up with solutions that can show the way for others. And I don't mean this as a gotcha question in any way. I was that kid who myself, all my clothes were from secondhand shops growing up, and whereas I might have felt iffy about an Army Navy stores, right? Which is maybe even a better analogy because, at first I had to, should I be embarrassed that I don't have a new nylon backpack? I have this Army surplus backpack, which my dad was really into. And now I'm like, of course, that's what I should have been doing. That surplus needed to go somewhere, right? And so I think your model is incredible. And I want to make sure I'm not sounding like I'm critiquing it, but how do you think about not just the innovation relationship, but making sure that even if incomes are lower in many places, we don't get into a dynamic where, well, you have the less energy efficient equipment because it's from 10 years ago or what have you. Do you think about these issues?
I don't think about it too often, but it is kind of funny. You were way ahead of your time because all of my nieces and nephews, they basically only shop in secondhand stores and Salvation Army. And that's kind of the cool way, as opposed to buying the new stuff. But, I think that the feedback that we get from buyers is that there's just so much thanks that there is an easy way for them to acquire these assets that otherwise would not enable them to continue to operate their business or provide care for patients. Whether the white plastic has converted a little bit to the yellow plastic or it's a Euro 5 engine on a tractor, that, yeah, it is going to pollute a little bit more than a brand new Euro 6 or a Euro 7 tractor, but they haven't had to create a new tractor, or they can actually get a tractor that works versus the tractor that just does not work and is a Euro 3 type of a polluter. Our customers generally are very, very happy that they have access to the assets and that there's a mechanism to actually find them. And that's really fundamentally one of the hardest things is finding the asset that you're looking for, and us being now a platform at scale that's building that flywheel effect. It is an easy way for people to get the assets that they're looking for.
Yeah, and we know, of course, that building a new piece of equipment has a huge carbon footprint, right?
Of course,
so it's years for an EV driver to start getting the carbon benefits. For example, I mean a consumer. So you're inherently doing something really powerful when you extend the life, and we don't need to build a new one. And you could add to that, look, there is a growing need. Every time an economy develops, especially in these industrial ways, there's a growing need for equipment. And we can't necessarily, as a planet, always be building a new piece of equipment. So I think it's very interesting where you've taken it, but I want to ask one crazy question. May I?
Yeah, of course.
Is there any piece potentially in the vision that could involve relationships with third-party retrofitters who, I'm thinking, I've done some consulting on a building will be retrofit to be passive house, for example,
Yeah.
right? Is there any relationship where you can take a great piece of metal, right?
Yeah.
Stick with a tractor, an MRI machine for now, and you can retrofit it with a different power source, or is that just crazy town?
It's absolutely not crazy town. We have not explored that yet. However, if you just look at some of these examples, especially in the classic car trade, which we're not in, but the classic car trade takes a lot of these older, much less efficient, much more of an energy pollutant type of a vehicle and changes out the engine. That type of a potential, I think, actually exists because the metal functionality of equipment, tractors, construction equipment, it doesn't change. What's inefficient, to your point, is the engine. And so is there a possibility in this world where we're helping extend the life of the shell and then
Yeah.
partnering with someone that can replace that core, that engine, to make that more efficient? I think that's a super interesting opportunity. We haven't done it yet, but it certainly is quite intriguing.
So last thing on this, because Mim, I know you have burning questions, which is if you've ever been to Havana or to Cuba, right?
Oh yeah, I have actually.
Right? On the one hand, it's like one big classic car show, right?
Yeah.
The whole country. But you also see, a car built in the 50s might have a great body, but invariably the window, the handles to open up your windows and to open your doors have needed to be replaced. So I mention this because it was fun just now as you spoke, imagining a world where instead of it being like, oh, here's the older, more yellowed piece of equipment, here is that classic piece of equipment in the beautiful way that we used to make it before we figured out how to make the auto body cheaper with state-of-the-art power, renewable energy power, for example.
Yeah, no, you can see it in the construction equipment, but to your point, yeah, even within MRI equipment or the other medical equipment, computer and technology equipment, the casing is still fine. It works perfectly. Sometimes you just need a new processor. You can jam that on in the inside. In a what if instead space where instead of you're just extending the life, you're also refurbishing it and upgrading it, but still using the majority of what the waste is, which is the product around it, the physical product. That would be really fascinating if we could potentially find a solution for that was efficient and economic.
So that was sort of my question about the economics of it, right? If these organizations buying these assets are relatively limited, I would think it would have to be an easy or inexpensive solution to retrofit, right? If they're buying stuff at 40% of cost, they might not have, I'm just going to throw out a number, they might not have $100,000 to retrofit every machine. I guess that would be my question of the sort of the cost benefit trade-off to them.
Yeah.
Of how you would do that.
Well, I think because where we are playing in depreciable life of an asset is really still in that 3 to 7 year horizon. It might be the next stage, and I don't think we have a solution for that second owner yet. And where they can take the asset to go. And I guess it really is an interesting thing to push on. We really are looking for the second life of the asset. I don't think there is an invention yet that looks at the third life. And the third life is the one, to both of your points, that's kind of replacing the smaller guts in the middle, the engine, the processor, the stuff that's easy to replace, easy air quotes, and then enables the physical shell to continue on. I think that is a really interesting thing that another inventor is going to come up with. And we haven't gotten there at this point.
I mean, imagine the job generation, right? Back to the Cuban cars for a moment. There were so many incredible tinkerers. I was there researching entrepreneurship during a period when a lot of chemists and physics teachers had started businesses owning their own cab, right? And so I'd interview them. And one of the things you realize that these were brilliant scientist types who had so much tinkering ability that they were keeping these 65-year-old cars on the road. And so what would the job creation possibility? Mim and I think all the time about how do you create waves of local jobs, right? All around the world. And I can imagine that third life, maybe the platform, TBAuctions, Second Life, in this what if instead scenario that we're playing with, could have all these local folks who then do the tinkering to extend third life or to adapt to other applications. You can start to imagine a world where, equipment, it's like a Genet movie, if I'm saying his name right, where, there's sort of contraptions that have been jerry-rigged and retrofitted and fitted and MacGyvered all around the world to various purposes.
Well, in a lot of ways, they already are. Your experience in Cuba, I've seen it in Cuba. You've seen it. I've seen it in India, where again, the asset is, retrofit. The engine is replaced. All the parts and pieces are replaced. And you don't have to extract more material from the ground to build the shell, which is really what's the useful part for the human beings. And you really do create that kind of ecosystem of the third or fourth or fifth life of an asset.
And it slices off the most capital intensive piece. This is what I'm fascinated with as we say this. Making that shell, there aren't a lot of small car companies, right? I mean, there are folks who do a few, but MRI production is not a cottage industry, right? MRI machine production, because it's super capital intensive. Go ahead, Mim.
The planned obsolescence was actually my next question, because you talked earlier, Tom, about we're really good at selling and producing junk, right? And
God, that's not junk.
Not us as a society. As a society, we're really good at selling and producing junk and things that break down really quickly and things that wear out and one-time use items and all of that. So I'm not saying you, I'm saying, right, okay.
Well, one of the reasons for that is that there is no easy market for the secondary life. So if you're buying a piece of furniture, you're basically buying it for 5 to 7 years and then throw it away. But if you buy a piece of furniture with the idea that in 5 or 7 years you can sell it and get 50% residual value, there's a different economic principle.
Right. And I'm thinking about this idea about the holding on to something or repurposing items, because we're seeing a lot of this in the small goods market. People upcycle. They take something that's they break it apart. I've seen this my daughter does this. She buys old sweaters at the thrift store, takes all the yarn and makes them into new stuff because it's better quality. But I just wonder how that plays out in this kind of a field. A, is planned obsolescence less of a thing? And B, if it's not, then how are these buyers making sure they actually get 5 to 7 years of life out of what they're buying?
It's an interesting question, and I don't know if the products that are being offered for sale now that are 5 to 7 years old will be different than the products that are being offered for sale in 5 or 7 years. I haven't really done analysis to look at the history to say, because everyone says, hey, I used to buy a washing machine and it would work for 20 years. Now I buy a washing machine, it works for 5 years. It's really interesting. I don't know if the planned obsolescence mentality, especially for the type of used business asset that we're looking at, will change the dynamics of the marketplace. Right now, I think a lot of that planned obsolescence is around consumer good. And, your phone, your clothing that you buy at Uniqlo, the furniture that you buy on Wayfair, those types of things are kind of designed, and we all know that they're designed to be disposable. I think generally still today, a business asset is not designed with that type of disposability. But I haven't explored it. I think it's a really interesting thing to see how that market will evolve in the next 5 to 7 year generation of equipment.
I think you're bringing up something very important, which is total cost of ownership.
Exactly.
Is something a business will often analyze, and most consumers don't have the wherewithal to analyze.
Right.
And if you're thinking, just for listeners, total cost of ownership is you think in terms of not just how much your inkjet printer costs, but also how much it costs to replace the cartridges and how frequently and when it broke and all this stuff, right?
Because businesses are professional buyers. So they have teams of people that think through those things. Who's sitting in their underwear buying a printer on Amazon does that? Probably no one.
Well, during COVID, no, seriously, but right, you just didn't know they were in their underwear because they had a tie on top. But seriously, the TCO point, right? The business buyer is thinking TCO. I mean, there may be exceptions to that because a large firm has people to do that. Whereas one of the things I'm very interested in your model is, we talked at the beginning, can a large mega farm, can equipment become accessible to a small farmer who may have less wherewithal to maybe more like a consumer in not having a team of people to calculate TCO. But I wanted to actually take this to a place you two brought up a few minutes ago. I interviewed a guy called Tom Saki, the TerraCycle founder, some years ago. And he said, look, the way we think about buying today is put as many things. If you're Amazon, you want people to put as many things in the basket as possible and replace that basket as often as possible, right? That is a vision of life. It's a vision that the little mouse with shiny objects in each of us is very susceptible to. It's a vision that we can be easily manipulated to do more of, till we also need to be customers of Marie Kondo because we're both filling that basket over and over and then having to take our larger and larger houses. Now I'm thinking of, Westerners in the suburbs, and constantly take the junk out of them, right? So that's a vision of life. And both you two made me think of, so I think where you're taking us is there could be a different way things work, not just in the platforms that enable it, but in how we think about these things across the world, around the world. And so what I wish I could ask you, if I knew how to formulate the question, is what does life look like if we go the full distance with what we're saying, where I'm a small farmer in Texas, like we've interviewed on this show. I am a person doing healthcare in Accra, such as we've interviewed in this show. And suddenly my world is not just the world we live in now, where I either have the budget for something capital intensive to make or I don't. But instead it's a budget it's a world where we've talked about, where there's all this tinkering and repurposing and reverse innovation going on. And it's a world very different from that fill up your basket as many times as you can, to a world where it's the access to stuff is something that has revenue models, but they're more in the direction that you're taking us.
I mean, it's that concept of kind of a global marketplace where you can easily find what you're looking for, regardless of physically where it is today, and be able to procure it, knowing that the procurement of that asset, regardless of where it is in the world, even when you figure out the CO2 of the transportation, you say it's a hell of a lot more efficient to use someone else's asset for the next 3 to 5 years than to go to my local store and buy another one. Because ultimately you're going to end up having to have that transportation anyway. It would be really phenomenal if there was kind of this global marketplace where you could find these things and trade them and eventually do it without currency. Would be fantastic.
In your version of the world, container ships are filled not with lots of new junk that's going to go into landfill.
It's really interesting you raise the concept of container ships, but if you look at global trade right now, many container ships, not all, travel fully laden from parts of the world to other parts of the world, and then travel back completely empty. And if you had this global marketplace, yes, you would have the trade of goods balancing that out. And so those ships would not be running empty. They'd be moving goods that need to be reused all around the world. And that could be a brand new piece of equipment that was used for 5 years in the Philippines that then gets shipped to Texas, and another piece of equipment from California that's shipped to Europe, and a piece that's then shipped from Norway down to South America. And that's not happening today. And it's partly because it's difficult to find the assets that you want. And part of what we're trying to build is that you can connect through what we call our technology platform, these different storefronts all around the world, so that those goods can be discovered, found, and then traded. And I think that's 100% right. That is the seamless goal of the reuse economy, where you can find things that again, are used in one area of the world that can be reused in another area of the world, and back and forth for a hell of a long time, a hell of a longer time than they're currently being used today.
So you've done something incredible economically just now.
Solving the empty ship problem? Yeah. Flexport and a whole bunch of other companies would be thrilled to hear that idea.
I mean, it's beyond the empty ship problem, though, because it's also potentially filling the waste ship problem, right?
Exactly,
the truth is, and I know that the reason that I buy a lot of plastic junk that I throw out next year is not directly related to how a company buys a big piece of equipment, but it is about a way of being, a way of existing. And if we got used to the idea that you're describing, just as in the example of used clothing, where for your daughters, I think you said, suddenly it's cool to have, maybe even the clothing has been restitched or something. That's become something that's aspirational. Well, similarly, when I was a kid, I was sometimes made fun of for those things, right? So it becomes a thing where we're not just accumulating waste, which, by the way, we're shipping in container ships around the world, right? But we were using our ability to transport things to repurpose. The carbon cost is lower, and the thing that I'm most excited, if I might add one more thing, back to my 2007 iMac, until last year when they made it totally impossible to run the new Mac OS on it, I had replaced virtually everything inside it. The best part is I wasn't a skilled tinkerer, but there were these great, there was the iFixit site, which would sell you the kit and show you how not to screw it up, which I usually did anyway, but eventually would, the point is that with that new fan, the company that made the little squeegee that could allow you to take the thing off, and the suction cups, all that is innovation and job creation. And so the biggest thing that I get excited about beyond the container ships is the idea that the vision of the economy you're describing is one where there can be a local flowering of skills, job creation, and then every person with that job is buying something locally, and you then build local capacity that otherwise is not built because you're just importing it. This is really Jane Jacobs' idea from somewhere else.
Yeah, no, absolutely. 100% true.
So given this idea about importing knowledge from elsewhere, where do you see TBAuctions knowledge being imported where it isn't now?
The idea of an auction as a mechanism for the owners of depreciated assets to get a relatively quick sale, a quick conversion to cash, and to find a further user for those products is not a new invention. What we're different in is that it's fully online and digital. The traditional business asset world has had a requirement that the seller bring the product onto a warehouse or onto some sort of a physical location where then the assets are sold. And Europe is very much ahead of the United States in terms of peer-to-peer sales of business assets, and that's where the seller doesn't bring the product to a location to be sold. The seller just sells it from their own garage, warehouse, or factory. As we look at taking this model where we've been able to connect local brands and a global economy, we're looking at the United States as a potential opportunity for where we can do that. And the U.S. and the sale of used business assets, there really isn't that kind of concept of fully online that we think we can really truly innovate with. So, part of our growth strategy is to start looking at opportunities to bring our technology into the U.S. auction space, the business-to-business auction space, where traditionally it has been very much more of an offline dinosaur type of a business that's highly inefficient. So that's where we're going. But this is a global industry. And as we were talking about earlier, I've got acquaintances in this industry from Australia to the Philippines to South Africa, where there are assets that need to be used by others, construction assets, mining assets that have, they've outlived their use in Australia. They can easily be put to use in Chile. And there really is no global connector of this type of used asset. And that's really where we see where we're going to be going, because we've built the technology that allows us to do it across Europe. Europe is very complex, very difficult. There's a lot of different regulations from country to country. If we've mastered it here, we do think we have the skill set to go kind of global and really start to flatten out the world. It's worked for technology, it's worked for communications. The world is not yet flat for assets. And that's really where we see the future of our company going, is flattening that out so that it's easy to move those assets around the world.
What's amazing about that is that the innovative potential and beyond potential, the innovators are there in each of those parts of the world.
Yeah.
Right now, I'm teaching, I lead along with facilitators all over the world, a global session, which has groups in 2 of the 3 countries you mentioned. And these are young people who are solving problems. What if we used the digital age, and very much the way you're saying, to connect these dots? Because we have a global economy, and yet we lack global innovation in so many cases. We're still coming up with practices as if it were the 19th or at least the 20th or maybe the early 20th centuries. How are you enabling those small players? It's a 3-part question. You can pick your favorite part. Through your user experience, through your platform, how are you enabling? Just talk to us a little about what are you doing to make these transactions possible, finding out about the equipment, buying the equipment in ways that it might not be obvious to a user of Facebook Marketplace. Secondly, just how does this depreciation thing work with the source companies? And thirdly, if you're interested or you have time, I'm intrigued in how you're planning on making this work in the Americas. It sometimes seems in the United States as if we have advanced and less advanced economies next to each other in this country and within the country. And I'm wondering if you're working within country or a lot of it has to do with Mexico, Canada, South America, Central America, and so forth.
You might have to prompt me again with the 3 as I go through them. But first, we have a goal of making it trivially easy for a buyer or a seller to meet each other, both through kind of just the ease of listing the product. We're humans. We are driven by our eyeballs. Having good pictures of the product that's available for sale is super important. So making it very easy, utilizing technology to help a seller get the right photos of the product that they're selling, to have a high quality description of what it is that they're selling, and making that an easy process so it's not going to take them 3.5, 4 hours to do that.
I actually loved your line, trivially easy. So for entrepreneurs in the digital space listening to this podcast, hear those words. Everything else is great, but until you make it trivially easy.
Yeah, it's sort of my North Star for all of my product teams to say, make it trivially easy. I love the expression. I think I'm not the owner of the expression. I've borrowed it from mentors I've had in my life. But doing that and making it easy for the transaction. And that's not just the listing of the product, but if you're selling a used asset, that you still have a loan associated with that used asset. Because sometimes the loans last longer than the asset itself, or at least they last longer than the depreciable life of the asset. We also help with the process of paying off the loan, all the paperwork associated with getting a lease to end or the loan to end. And some of these buyers are buying assets that are 10, 20, 100,000 euros of value, providing the access to a new lender. So we provide value-added services around lending, ending a loan relationship, creating a new loan relationship, ending a lease relationship, creating a new lease relationship. Similarly with insurances and warranties, when you buy a new used asset, you kind of want to make sure it's still going to work. And so still having a warranty on that product is of value to you. So we like to make it easy to get the access to the same products and services that would be associated with purchasing a new asset. The piece that we have not really solved for yet is the transportation and the logistics. And that is a really, really hard nut to crack. It's on our roadmap to help figure out how do you facilitate those logistics. Really, to talk about what we have been discussing for the last half hour or so is the ease of the transportation of these assets at low CO2 emissions rates so that customers can get the products that they're looking for. We do that in experiments with some of our assets here and there, but it is an area that we continue to work on so that we can make it, like I said, a trivially easy experience to buy and sell used assets, from the financing of it, the warranties associated with it, and the transport logistics of it. We do a lot in terms of helping sellers remove the equipment, especially when it's a factory that's been closed down in Germany, and potentially the equipment from that used factory is going to be moved to a new factory that's being established in Indonesia. We do also provide export and customs and other types of services that enable the product to move, but the logistics we're still not an expert in helping to provide that service to customers.
You've made me think of one thing, and then I'm happy to give you the last couple prompts, and we really appreciate your taking these few extra minutes with us. I work with innovators in the South African townships through the Bia Nelson movement and Street Biz. And one of the things that I've been learning recently, it's quite striking. If you look at solar voltaic panels installation in South Africa, in I think 15 months between 22 and 23, it more than quadrupled. And what's interesting is this is happening because solar panels, you can just get them and you don't have to be on grid to do this, right?
Yeah. And the cost of them have gone down dramatically, absolutely.
Exactly. And so what you're making me think is that so many other things between the container ship and the large shell and everything we've talked about in this conversation, that solar panels have been possible because they're cheap and easy to transport. And so it's cheaper for me. South Africa is a country that suffers many power outages to just install, right? And I also work with folks who do peer-to-peer, right? But are there possibilities in what you're doing that suddenly we could make that local resourcefulness possible? That's just magnifying and mushrooming these capacities with more than just something that's flat and easy to transport. That's what you're really making me excited about.
Yeah, and it is. It's super exciting. The opportunity there and the ability to get these assets into areas where the labor, frankly, to do some work on them is a hell of a lot cheaper than where the asset started from. Yeah, you really can start thinking about applying some labor to do the modification that's necessary to not just extend the life, but also potentially even change the dynamic of the product that's moved from one to another location.
And let's seize on that changing of the product dynamic, because that I think is the most exciting piece of all, is that we kind of assume our use cases, right? The MRI machine is actually the classic Govindarajan and Trimble case, right? It's huge. We install it, we use it in this way, we get these approvals. But there are so many ways we can use these products in new ways and innovate their use. Just as in consumer tech, often the really interesting use is consumer innovated.
Yeah, absolutely.
The last two things that I had on my mind was to just understand what we mean by depreciation. Maybe we'll just leave listeners with the fact that often, in terms of how you budget when you're a large firm, if you can get, because you've fully costed, you fully paid for in your accounting a piece of equipment by a certain point in time, after that, any cash you get for that equipment it's gravy. It's free money. Is that an oversimplistic way to put it, Tom? I just wanted to make sure listeners got this.
Highly simplistic, but it's 100% accurate. You buy an asset for 100, you depreciate it 20% over 5 years, it's zero. You sell it for 40. Hey, it's money in the bank. It's free profit. You're 100% right.
I'm going to take this as a high compliment. My favorite thing, and I got this, frankly, from Arnold Schwarzenegger's email, and it's from Bruce Lee. And it says, "One does not accumulate, but eliminate. It is not daily increase, but daily decrease. The height of cultivation always runs to simplicity." So thanks for what you're doing to make that possible in the world of equipment, and for calling me simplistic and right.
You're the only one who could get away with that, Tom. So thank you.
Hardly. You simplified a complex problem. That's a beautiful thing. That's my favorite. My favorite in the world is to do that.
Well, it's a beautiful thing what you're doing, Tom, and thank you for making us think here on What If Instead. It's a real pleasure, and we wish you a great evening.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much.